We're always looking for speakers for TVUG. If you'd like to do a presentation, please reach out to us at meetup.com/TechValleyNetUserGroup. Looking for other user groups to attend? Please visit meetup.com/.net-virtual-user-group.
Hi, folks, and welcome. Tonight is definitely night for me. I gather it's sort of early evening for you. It's just after 11 o'clock here in the UK, which means that for once I am unlikely to run very long. This presentation, well, it's been a little while since I've given it, and the software that I'm talking about has changed since then, which means anything can happen, frankly. But usually I tend to ramble on a bit. So tonight I will fall asleep rather than rambling on, because I just won't be able to keep up much after midnight. I'm somewhat like Cinderella and turning into a pumpkin. Let me start presenting my screen. One of my screens. I should apologize in advance that one of the things with this presentation is I have to switch between presenting my slides and presenting demos, and the demos themselves need to switch between what I see as the person operating the software and what folks in the church see. And that's sort of given away a little bit about what we're talking about tonight, but let's dive in. So the sort of theme of this is integration, but we're really going to do a deep dive into what I've been doing, how Jon spent his pandemic, basically. And I start all my slide decks these days with a slide like this, saying be kind, whether it's to those with different skills in this case, because we'll be thinking about people who don't do much computing and maybe are nervous of computers and how you build software for them. But I often have, be kind to the person serving you in the next restaurant you go into, whoever it is, healthcare workers who are looking after you if you get sick in the pandemic, whatever it is. I will briefly explain why I started doing this. I was at Caribbean DevConf, which was a fantastic conference, and I had decided to present without a slide deck, and the conference organizer said, okay, that's fine, we'll just put a big picture of you behind on the big screen behind you. It's like, no, you can't do that. It's bad enough seeing me once, seeing me twice is awful. Just put be kind. And so we did that with the trans flag colors. And I've sort of started doing that from then on, because I figure if by any chance I can nudge the dial very slightly on people being kind, actually that would mean more to me than if you all end up doing brilliant things with dates and times and versions and integration, which tend to be the things I talk about these days. Being kind is more important than any of those things. I'm sure you are all kind people to start with, but I just feel that we could all do with a bit of a nudge, bit of a reminder, because it's so easy to get cross with someone and end up, with that brilliant passive aggressive put down. And I'm hoping that just a nudge saying, yeah, just remember, kindness is great, is all you need. Okay, so I've had this warning up every time I've done this talk, which is, I think this is something like the fourth time. It hasn't become any more structured, but it seems to kind of work. One of the things that makes it work is if people give me feedback as we go along in terms of asking questions. How does something work? Why did you choose to do something like that? That's really useful, and particularly if things don't make sense in terms of why is this software necessary or whatever it is. This is the first time I think I've given this talk internationally. It's been remote every time because pandemic. But it may well be that your experience of church, if you have any experience of church at all, and if you don't worry about it. It's, I will explain everything you need to know. Your experience of church may well be very different in the US. My understanding is that churches are significantly bigger, richer, etc. So they probably have fantastic engineers and software already. But just let me know if anything's not clear. Okay, so why am I giving this talk? Partly because I just love presenting this stuff. I've been having a lot of fun. It's been a lot of work as well, but the last coming up to 2 years, I have spent a lot of time writing code for my local church, and it's been a lot of fun. So I like to talk about it. I do reflect on the ways in which this software is different from other software I would write, and how, in particular, I'm going to talk about 2 applications, and one of these applications is only used by my church, the church I attend. The other one that I've got, the other program, is used by maybe a dozen other people total. So they have some slightly different requirements to me, and that's fine. But other than that, for the main thing that I'll talk about, called At Your Service, it's entirely my church, which means we need 3 cameras. I will make the code work for 3 cameras. If you want 4, I've got to go back and do more stuff, but that's okay. I do want to think about how projects like this that are mostly about integration work slightly differently from something like NodaTime, which is the code base that I've spent probably most of my time on, even compared with professional life. NodaTime has taken a lot of my time, and that's completely different. Coding for NodaTime and coding for At Your Service are very, very different. But, and this final bullet point is by far the most important thing, I want you to spend half the time that you would possibly be listening to me instead dreaming, saying, oh, I really want to do that project with a robot, or that project with some amazing sound device, whatever it is. I've had a lot of fun even before doing this kind of thing with coding for my drum kit, and that's a whole other talk. But all the time, the idea is, if I can have lots of fun doing integration stuff, I'm sure you can. Maybe it's not even integration stuff. Just find something you'll enjoy coding about, and go do it. So, introduction to Tilehurst Methodist Church. This is the church I have belonged to for 24 years now. I've been a steward in 2 cycles. I'm probably about to volunteer to be a steward again. We'll see. Oh, this is being recorded, so now people find out. I guess I better head to it. But I go there a lot. I've been sort of in charge of the audiovisual system, the AV system, for quite a while. But before the pandemic, we had a computer that would project hymn words onto the screen, and we had a mixer. And this was our audio mixer. And it's a Mackie CFX12, and it's got effectively 10 inputs. It sort of calls it 12 because 2 of them are stereo, but it's effectively 10 inputs, 6 outputs, I think, which are split into 4 subs and a couple of mains, and it worked fine. But this mixer has about 150 knobs and dials and buttons and things on it, of which we used basically the faders at the bottom, the sliders. I've learnt over the course of the past 2 years that they're actually called faders, and the mute buttons, and that was pretty much it. So we controlled volume and we muted, and that was it. Now that's quite an intimidating thing to see. It's almost sort of the physical equivalent of if you first load Visual Studio or whatever your favorite IDE is, and it's all, I've got 15,000 buttons and you've no idea what you're doing. If you come and you're faced with this and you're not a fan of technology, you want to do your bit for your local church, you hear they need some people to run the AV during services, that's kind of tricky. And typically, one of the problems when we're doing services, certainly pre-pandemic, basically you were showing hymns on the screen and you were turning microphones on and off. And not even very many microphones. There was the one at the lectern, that's where people read from, and maybe the pulpit microphone, and we had a couple of radio mics. There were far more things, so if we were playing a video, we could use the computer's output, etc. But for the most part, it was turning microphones on and off, and then showing hymn words. But even that, you tend to have to do them at the same time. So as the hymn is starting, you want to mute the preacher, and you've got to remember to do that, because the last thing anyone wants, certainly if I'm preaching, because I'm a Methodist local preacher as well, the last thing anyone wants is to hear the preacher singing amplified over the sound system. So you've got to remember to mute the preacher and start the hymn words, and at the end you've got to do the opposite. You've got to take the hymn words down and unmute the preacher, otherwise the preacher's starting the next prayer and no one can hear them, and you get all the people in the congregation turn around and look at you and stare. Yeah, they're lovely people, but they can stare, and you know that something's wrong. So you've got two things to do at once. Okay, I'll come back to that, the fact that that's currently two things before the pandemic. So pandemic hit March 2020. In the UK, at least, that was when we went into lockdown. And for a few weeks, Tilehurst Methodist Church, if you only counted Sunday morning services, Tilehurst Methodist Church did nothing. In reality, lots of stuff was going on in the background with pastoral concerns, lots of phone calls going on. How are you? Can I get you any shopping, etc., etc. But we didn't have any services until Easter Day 2020. And on that day, our minister, Andy, led our first Zoom service. So everyone was on Zoom. No one was in the church building at all. So everyone was at home. And Andy played videos via screen sharing and did all his normal preaching and praying, etc. He did everything. We decided after that service that that was not an appropriate way to split the responsibilities, and that actually, if he spent his time concentrating on the preaching and the praying and leading worship, and someone else, me, spent my effort doing all the transitions between videos and Andy preaching and someone doing a reading, etc., then things could be a bit slicker and significantly less stressful for Andy. So the next week, that's what happened. And I think possibly the week after, that's what happened as well. But in the course of those one or two services, I started to get cross with Zoom. Not as cross as I tend to get with Teams, but I was getting cross with Zoom, because every time I wanted to show a video, I would have to click on screen share and then click on yes, I want audio, and yes, it's motion video, and that's the screen I want to share, then start the video. And the congregation, meanwhile, were going, is something going to happen soon? It felt really slow. In practice, it was probably only about 5 seconds per hymn, but it feels like a lifetime when you're the one desperately clicking. So I looked on the Zoom website and found they had an SDK written in C# even, or at least accessible in C#. There's C++ version as well that the C# SDK is built on top of. And so I started building the first of the applications that I'm talking to you tonight about, which is called Zoom and Enhance, which I felt was a particularly witty pun on the whole Zoom and Enhance in CSI and the like. I suspect that very, very few people who've ever seen this get the pun at all, but I'm hoping that you good folks will appreciate it. So Zoom and Enhance is a WPF application, and the first thing you'll notice, you don't even need to be able to see the details of the user interface here, but you'll notice that I'm not a very good user interface designer. I do like tabbed interfaces, and I do like group boxes. So you can see 4 group boxes even just there, and you'll see some more later on when I show you actual service. It works for me as a user interface, but it is clunky. I would love to see what a genuine professional user interface designer would do with the functionality I need to expose. However, Zoom and Enhance did its job remarkably well. So all that this did was automate things that Zoom could do already, for the most part anyway. Had a couple of extra features that I'll come to. So you could save the details of a meeting, log in with one of a few users that you configured, start a meeting, and then in the Director tab, you could load a playlist effectively of videos and songs, whatever it is, and then just double click on one and it would mute everyone, start the screen share with video and audio, depending on how you configured things. Start the video after starting the screen share. It was all good. And then at the end, you would just double click on the name of a person in the director tab, and it would spotlight them and unmute their microphone and all kinds of good stuff. It had a couple of extra neat features, which I still think Zoom should really have this at some point. A simple feature called auto rename. Now, I don't know how much experience you've had with Zoom, and with Zoom used by people who aren't very technical. And you know, no reason why everyone should be technical. You'll see a lot of people who have a name of iPad Henry or something like that. Starting with iPad and then their name and maybe an email address or brackets too, and all kinds of things that you really don't want. They don't look great. And if anyone joins by phone, which we had a few people who didn't have an internet connection at all, but they did have a landline, so they would call in on the appropriate phone number and they could then listen to the whole service, but then their phone number comes up. So all that Zoom and Enhance has is a text file saying, when you see someone called 0118 blah 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 blah, then rename them to Lucy or whatever it is. And that in itself is really useful and should be part of Zoom, I think. Likewise, the other sort of extra feature that Zoom doesn't have is I had a chat-based subscription thing. So we found that we had up to about 80 people or 80 screens would join Zoom. And generally, we'd open the meeting about a quarter of an hour before the service started, and people would be greeted, say, oh, hi, Liz, nice to see you. How are you doing? And this was really good for inclusion. People felt welcomed because someone had said hello to them. But every so often, certainly if you get a flurry of people, you can lose track of who's being greeted and who's just arrived. So I had a little subscription thing. So if you sent me, as in the user running Zoom and Enhance, which just launches a normal Zoom session, really, if you sent a chat message just to me saying, subscribe to joins, then anytime someone joined, it would send you a chat message saying, Toby has just joined the service. And that way, if you have just a few people in the congregation who have subscribed to those join notifications, then they can make sure that everyone feels welcomed. Everyone gets a, hi, how are you doing, Sophie, whatever, whoever it is. Everyone gets included. And that was really important to me. And really, you can imagine how easy this is to code, because Zoom's doing all the hard work. It gives me the notification in code. All I've got to do is keep a list of which users have subscribed to join and leave notifications and just send them a chat message. It's the value that you can get out of the integration is vastly bigger than the effort you need to put in. And that's sort of one of the key messages from this whole session. So that was Zoom and Enhance. And the requirements for Zoom and Enhance were really, this is all about Zoom. You know, the clue is in the title. So it's not really designed for hybrid services as we started having in early to middle of 2021, and other churches had earlier than that, where sort of most people were in the church building or half and half, something like that. Zoom and Enhance is really for most stuff is happening on Zoom. It was designed for someone who was technically comfortable, so me or a few other people. I kind of let a few other people install it and handheld them a bit, wrote a 20-page user guide, but it wasn't trying to be desperately, it was as user-friendly as I had time to make it.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
You had a question? Someone asked if you had any Zoom bombing concerns during the service.
Ah, right. Great question. So we didn't have any Zoom bombing concerns because our Zoom services, the link was only ever sent out with our church notices. So, we have a few, my parents now quite often join in our services because they're sort of friends of the church, so they're now included in the email distribution list, so they have the link that way. But we don't have anyone who doesn't know anyone in the church wouldn't have the link, wouldn't have the passcode, so we don't have any problems on that front at all. And it also means we don't have problems when it comes to, if some kids do readings, we don't worry about who's looking at the kids because they're all people we know. You know, only the normal level of safeguarding concerns that you would have anyway in a church. It's not like it's all public. We're not putting the whole service on YouTube. Certainly not back then. Now we have some of it on YouTube, which I'll come to later. But yeah, fortunately, Zoom bombing wasn't a concern. I guess if it had been because we'd done public things, maybe I'd have found some features that would have helped on that. I don't know. Anyway, thanks for the question. And apart from anything else, thank you for reassuring me that people are still there, because currently I've got very little idea. So I did have a couple of other users, and one of them wanted the streaming integration, which didn't take long to implement. And I think I've told you about all of the features here. Yeah. Oh, there is Stream Deck integration, which I will come back to later on. Stream Deck, if you haven't seen a Stream Deck, I will show you on the webcam. This is a normal Stream Deck. Hopefully you can see that. The Stream Deck I actually use for other things is a Stream Deck XL, and there'll be some screenshots of that later on. Stream Decks are great things. We didn't use them very much for Zoom and Enhance. It was more of a novelty and a way of experimenting with Stream Decks, because I knew that what was coming next would need a bit more. So what did I learn from doing Zoom and Enhance? Firstly, that this can be lots of fun, but there can be some weird things going on as well. So for a while, at least, when I did spotlighting, we use spotlighting in Zoom a lot. And if you haven't used Zoom, spotlighting is when, instead of each person choosing, am I going to see the current speaker just by who's actually spoken last and been broadcast, and gallery view where you see everyone, spotlighting is, no, you will see this person. So even if we're saying the Lord's Prayer together and everyone's unmuted, no, we still see whoever is leading the Lord's Prayer because they're the one spotlit. So we use spotlighting a lot, and it had a weird bug on the iPad for a few weeks where it would always spotlight the previous person who'd been spotlit. So if I had, let's take the canonical Alice, Bob, and say Colin. If Alice did a reading, then we had a video, then Bob did a prayer, then we had a video, and then Colin preached a sermon. Then when Bob was spotlit for everyone else, iPads and only iPads would see Alice. And then when Colin was spotlit, iPads would see Bob. And the trouble is that the people being spotlit just for iPads weren't aware of this. So they were potentially picking their nose, having a bit of cake, drinking some coffee, unaware that just for some users, they were still full front and center. So that was a bit weird. And there's still an oddity around breakout rooms so breakout rooms are, you can divide a meeting into several small sub-meetings, and then they all come back at the end. And when you all come back, you have the option, whoever's running the meeting launches the breakout rooms, and when they say close, then everyone gets a little 1-minute timer, except if you're running Zoom and Enhance, in which case you get shoved straight back to the main meeting immediately. No idea why. Other things around the Zoom SDK, it was public on GitHub, and then the GitHub repo became just a README saying, go download it over here, which is kind of annoying. And they have many SDKs, and whether Zoom cares about the one that you happen to be using or not, the C# SDK tended to be a few features behind the C++ SDK, just because they hadn't done the wrapping work to expose all the newest features. Other things I learned from Zoom and Enhance, documentation. I had, as I mentioned, about a 20-page user guide, and that takes a long time to write with lots of screenshots. And whenever you change things, change the way things look, you need to take all the screenshots again, and it's frustrating, but really important. Installers, you can't really, if you've got fairly competent, technically competent people, but who really don't want to be messing around on their boxes too much, you need an installer, and it needs to work and take you through everything. And in order to make sure that everything works, you need logs. And when it comes to integration, the logic in the code is very rarely the difficult part, and that's true for at your service as well. There are very few algorithms, so to speak. Instead, it's, oh, well, it turns out that I can work around the iPad spotlighting bug if I spotlight, then cancel the spotlight, then spotlight again. Okay, that seems to work. That's not hard code to write, but it's knowing that you need it that's the difficult bit. And this is where there's a huge difference between this and NodaTime, and all the work I do for Google professionally. There are no unit tests or no tests at all for Zoom and Enhance, partly because they would be really difficult to write. You know, having to work out how to fake out the whole of the Zoom SDK, well, that's kind of tricky. And while they might help in terms of the way that tests normally help you write better code, they could help on that front. They would almost certainly not have found any bugs. I don't remember seeing any bugs that normal kinds of tests would have found. If you're writing integration code and you can test, please do so. That's great. Please don't take away the message, John doesn't think that we should write tests. No, that's not the case at all. It's just different situations call for different tests. And while I would love there to be a comprehensive test suite for both Zoom and Enhance and at your service, I think I've made the right choice in focusing my time, because I've got limited time like everyone else, on the code that I have written. Okay, so moving on from Zoom and Enhance, we come to hybrid church. So this was the situation we were in from about April, May 2021, where some of us were in the church building. Initially, it was just me and Andy, who was our minister at the time. And then it became me and Andy and a baptismal party. We had a lot of baptisms and weddings that have been sort of queuing up, unable to take place during the pandemic. But then we got regular members of the congregation, so to speak, particularly focusing on people who either couldn't attend via Zoom at all or were really uncomfortable doing so. And so we wanted to get them back into the church building as quickly as we could. You might notice me saying church building quite a lot, by the way. This is one of the things where I find terminology is really important. And I've made a conscious effort since about April of 2020 to separate out the church, which is the people worshipping God in fellowship together. It's a community. And the church building, which is a load of bricks. We have great fondness for our church building, but that is not the church. So when I welcome people to church, that is welcoming the people in the church building and on Zoom, wherever they are worshipping at the time. So we went into this hybrid church model. Initially, maybe 10% of people in the church building, 90% of people still on Zoom. By October, November 2021, it became more like 50-50 or maybe even 60-40, most people in church, only a few people on Zoom. Then Omicron hit the UK and we are just starting to reopen again. We had a couple of services that were just me and Helen, our new minister, in the church building. That was a very odd Christmas Day morning service with just two of us in the church building. That's very strange indeed. Possibly a steward as well. But now we are starting to get people back in. So what does that look like? What are the requirements at that point? Well, I started to think about the AV requirements, not just for now with hybrid church, but the longer term as well. Excuse me. Because since very early in the pandemic, I've seen the silver lining of this terrible blight on the world, which is that the church and companies and all kinds of people have realized what we can do remotely. And in particular for the church, we have been letting down the housebound for decades. A lot of the technology that we're using could have been available, and I'm sure some churches were really forward thinking. It's taken us a long time. The only way you used to be able to be part of worship at Tilehurst Methodist Church was by showing up at the church building at the time. When it came to Zoom meetings, anyone who was at home with an internet connection was able to join. And so that meant that people who were housebound, so long as they did have an internet connection or a phone and were happy to call in, could be part of the worship. That's great. And it's not just the housebound. You immediately start thinking of the elderly. But what about if you're a new parent and your baby is screaming the house down, and you don't want to take them to a church building where you might get some not so pleasant looks, or even if everyone's really lovely about the fact that your baby is screaming a lot, you're still going to feel bad about it. Well, if you can join from home, you can join from home. It's great. Maybe you're ill yourself. Maybe you're looking after someone who's ill. Maybe you're on holiday. There are loads of reasons why you may not be able to make it to the church building, but you could still make it to a Zoom service. So I have been determined since very early on, right, we're on Zoom, we're never coming off Zoom, or at least we're never coming off having some sort of internet-enabled experience. Yeah, eventually maybe we'll move from Zoom to Meet or whatever it is. But for the moment, Zoom. That in itself means we need to have cameras in the church. So previously we did not have a camera at all because we wouldn't need it. A couple of times I took my own webcam so that we could show a baptism on the screen, so that if there were a lot of people and some people didn't have a good view, they could always see the screen and they could see the baptism. But it was very ad hoc, only very occasional. When we've got a camera, then it's going to be great if we're doing weddings over Zoom anyway, because not everyone can get to the church building, due to either geographical reasons or the limits on numbers. Well, if we're broadcasting on Zoom anyway, why don't we just record it? And then we can give the bride and groom or the baptismal party or whoever it is the video of the service afterwards. And that's really nice. That's a sort of value add for the church if you start thinking of the church in a business sense, which obviously I don't really, but it's terminology wise, it's a good value add that's really easy to do. But coming to the first of these bullet points, eventually we need it to be accessible to significantly more people than just me. So during the pandemic, so this is nearly 2 years, I have probably run the AV for all but about 6 of the services at Tilehurst Methodist Church. And that's not sustainable, partly because I'm a local preacher. I want to be preaching out and about as well. And partly it's just, I've got other things to do on some Sundays, and it would be terrible for me to be the bottleneck saying, well, if John's away, then we can't have a service. So the same people who used to manage with the mixer I showed you before need to also be able to manage with the new system. But now we're playing more videos than we used to. And we've got a camera to manage as well. And we've got Zoom to manage as well. And these are often people who, even if they're happy, right, you've told me exactly what I need to do. That's great. Please don't ask me to do anything that's surprising during the service. Well, if you're having to switch to different people on Zoom, if we didn't have an integrated system, it would just not be feasible. So my goal was, okay, we've got all these extra features that we need to put in, but anyone who was comfortable with the old system, which remember was still quite intimidating, should be able to manage with the new system as well. So audio was sort of the first of the things that really struck me as something that I needed to integrate, because a lot of other stuff already was software based. You know, you're showing videos over software, you're joining Zoom over software. Those are easy to integrate into one application. What do you do about audio? We had a bunch of microphones, only used a relatively small number in most services, but there were quite a few microphones available, but we didn't need to do very much with them. The hardware mixer that I showed before, and which I can show again, that one, it's really nice and tactile. You know, you move a slider, a fader, it does what you expect it to. Hopefully you can see whether a button is muted or not, or whether the mute button is down or not. You're not looking for something on a screen, so that's kind of attractive. But it's still really complicated when there's 120 buttons that you're told never to press. Yeah, that's tricky. There is such a thing as a digital mixer, which I'll show you. The hardware for a digital mixer is something like this. This is actually the XR18 that is sitting 2 feet away from me now in my shed. And yes, it's kind of ridiculous that I have this many audio inputs and outputs in my shed. This is a shed that is like about 3 meters deep by 5 meters wide, something like that. And just looking around, I can see 8 microphones plus the microphone that's actually plugged into the computer that you're hearing, as it were. And there's at least another couple of microphones put away, and there are 4 computers that have inputs into this mixer. It is massive overkill, but this is the exact same hardware model that we have in the church building as well, where we genuinely kind of need to be able to have that many different inputs when we've got things like the organ and a microphone by the piano, etc. So that's a digital mixer in that if you compare the number of buttons, you can just about possibly see a volume knob in the bottom right hand side there. I don't know whether you can see my mouse, but I'm sort of hovering around it now next to the purple cable. So there is that, and there's the volume knob. Sorry, not the volume knob. There's a power switch on the side of the unit, and those are the only physical controls on the mixer at all. So big difference. But how do you then control it? Well, obviously the XR is going to come with its own software. It's not like Behringer is going to say, right, here's some hardware. Work out how to control it yourself. But this is the software that comes with it, for Windows at least. And this is sort of the computer equivalent of the mixer before with 150 knobs. And in fact, this UI, we're currently showing the channel part of the UI, and there's all kinds of other bits as well. I find it quite intimidating, and I mostly know what's going on. So that's really tricky. Well, we can make this easier. Bear in mind, this is a really capable bit of kit. It can do all kinds of sound effects and all kinds of things that we don't need as a church. We can set things up in advance. Even if we needed a sound effect on one microphone, we could set that up before, and we don't need to do it during the service. So I came up with this as user interface. So for each of the channels, you can mute and unmute and change the volume, and that's it. And you can see what the levels are. I've only just noticed, it's ridiculous that the fader is on the right hand side. Excuse me, on the right hand side for the inputs and on the left hand side for the outputs. And I suspect that's still the case. And that's an inconsistency that I have been living with and unaware of. Yep, it is still the case for best part of a year now. Ridiculous. I shall try to fix that. But it does the job. So you can see the input levels, you can tweak things, and there's a slight fiddly aspect that different faders could have, different channels might have different volumes for amplification for different outputs. So where I've got here main, Panther, work laptop, and sleepy, even though it says input faders, it's saying what that input should go to as an output. So it's saying when you control the input faders in the group box below, you are controlling what volume goes to, in this case, main, and then there's Panther, work laptop, and sleepy. In church, there's the church building speakers. Then there's out to the computer, which goes over Zoom. There's the hearing loop system, and there's a separate bass speaker. So we still have different outputs. But even so, it's a generally simpler user interface in software. But it's actually still relatively fiddly to use, particularly when you've got other stuff that you want to have on screen at the time. What's much better is what's called an XTouch Mini. So the one that you can see on the PowerPoint presentation is actually this one that you can see on my webcam now, hopefully. I can't see my own webcam for some reason, so I'm assuming it's still all working. And this is a lovely bit of kit. This is A, cheap, B, it does pretty much exactly what we need it to. So it has 16 buttons, if we ignore the ones over on the far right hand side, one fader that I use as the master volume, main volume, and 8 sort of knob buttons. We don't actually use the fact that you can press those in at the top, but you can twiddle them to be the volume, and in the church building they control the volume that is amplified within the church building. And that bottom row of buttons, so there are 2 rows of buttons, and they are both sets of mutes. So if the light is on, then sound will come out of that, or we're using that input. If the light is off, it's muted. So most things are muted most of the time. And it turns out that quite a few of our inputs in the church building, we don't need to change the volume that's being amplified in the church building, because they're not being amplified in the church building at all. The organ has its own speakers. The only reason we're capturing the organ is to pipe it out, no pun intended, to pipe it out to Zoom. So all we need to do is be able to mute and unmute it. Likewise, the piano, likewise, singers, for example. So it took me a while to realize this, but that bottom row of buttons is fine to be mutes and unmutes as well. Previously, I had to say, okay, well, we've got 8 inputs that you can do easily, and the other inputs, yeah, you need to go into the software, but now you don't. So let me see where I've got to. As I said, this was slightly unstructured. There are a few bits of I'm going to come back to these. These are technically interesting bits, but they're not as fun. Let's go into where the integration points are. So you learn lots of acronyms when doing integration work. So these are all the things that my one program touches. So the XTouch Mini that I've shown you uses MIDI to communicate, and so does our church organ. It turns out that you can play our church organ via a MIDI port. So I have a very long USB cable and a USB to MIDI converter at the end of it. And it so happens that our organist, David, has recorded himself playing the organ. And the way it works, a pipe organ, or in our case, electronic pipe organ, has lots of different stops to make it sound differently, different instruments, as it were. And MIDI maps each stop to a different instrument, different MIDI instrument. So where you might think, oh, this is a guitar or something like that. Well, no, that's the 12-foot diapason or whatever organ stop it is. But it means that if I now play David's recordings, if David isn't available to play the organ, it can still sound just like David playing it, which is great. We use open sound control, which that sounds like it's a really well-documented protocol that everyone uses. Turns out it's not terribly well documented, and only a few things use it. I think there were grander designs for it originally, but it's still useful. Everywhere, if you can find documentation, it's worth its weight in gold, is documentation for protocols. So the XR18 that I showed you, the digital mixer, uses open sound control. There are other digital mixers that I nearly got, which have different protocols. I don't think I've seen any digital mixer that is really built for people to do integration like this. They kind of expect you to use their own software, and that makes perfect sense. But it's been absolutely brilliant for us that we can do this. If they didn't have a protocol that was at least somewhat documented, it would have all been completely impossible. The cameras that we use, we started with one camera and then found actually we want another couple, partly so that we can switch between showing the pulpit and showing the lectern, or different places in the church without having to wait for the camera to pan round. All our cameras are pan, tilt, zoom cameras, so with optical zoom you can get fixed cameras, so just pointing at the pulpit, for example, not a good idea in my view if you happen to be designing a church AV system yourself. So we use NDI to capture the output from the cameras, and that's a relatively recent protocol used in a lot of actually professional video scenarios, but it's a network protocol, and they provide an SDK, including a WPF view, which is what I use. But for controlling, so that's the sort of data plane, as it were, of the camera, the control plane of the camera, we use something called Visca, which is, I think, really quite an old protocol that used to go over dedicated wires, but there's Visca over TCP, which quite a few cameras, a lot of which are, I think, based on Min-array hardware. So we use PTZ optics. I've personally got one PTZ optics and one Min-array, and they interoperate just fine. We use VLC to play videos. We can play PowerPoint, although I've currently got some issues with that, which are weird. Obviously, we're still interoperating with Zoom, including being able to say, okay, so Sally was going to read today, but she's got COVID, but she's feeling fine, so that's fine. We can still have her doing the reading. We'll just switch to her on Zoom. And At Your Service makes that nice and easy. We start OBS when we start At Your Service so that it just records everything, and then I can take it at the end of the day, chop it up a bit, put some of it on YouTube. Stream Deck. So I will show you some pictures of the Stream Deck in a minute when I've done a bit more of a demo, and I realize I'm coming to my pumpkin time at the moment. But the Stream Deck is really interesting. Some people, because I'm not the only user of this, some people want to use the Stream Deck as much as possible and want to leave the keyboard and mouse alone entirely. Other people hardly touch it. It just can't be bothered. I'll do everything with keyboard and mouse. And I can completely understand that. Different things for different people, but it's really useful to have those different options. I do have a USB foot pedal that is hard-coded, or well, configured rather, to press the right arrow when I press it. The reason, and I've stopped doing this because it didn't quite work, not technically, but just my brain. There is the junior church band at Tarhurst Methodist Church, which isn't really a junior church band, but historically it was. But while most of our services are accompanied by organ and piano for hymns, once a month the band assembles, and we've got flutes and oboes and clarinets and me on the recorder sometimes. But if I'm sitting on the AV desk, how am I meant to play the recorder and also advance the hymn words as it goes from verse to verse. Well, I have a foot pedal for that. So I can be playing along and tap my foot and it moves to the next verse. Turns out that my brain doesn't work well enough to do that multitasking, but it's still fun that it's feasible. And then we use Google Cloud Storage via the library that I maintain, which is quite nice for storing installers. And I need to update this deck because for a few months now, we've been able to prepare a service. I've been able to prepare the service at home, upload it to Google Cloud Storage, go into the church building, say download, it downloads any videos, words, etc., and then we're ready to go. So those are the things that we can integrate. Let me give you a little demo. So if I, in fact, I don't need to stop sharing. I will stop presenting. So just a few examples of things that you might want to do in a service. So this is me talking to camera 1 as far as I'm concerned in my shed. You can now probably see 2 of me. So 1, I've got a webcam that I'm pointing at now. So if you look at the webcam, there's a finger pointing at it, but I'm looking at one of my pan tilt zoom cameras, and I can pan and tilt it. Okay, that's really weird. Normally this works absolutely fine. It has now decided not to do any panning and tilting. And oh, the other one's fine. If I switch to the other camera, hello, this is another camera, and this does pan tilt, no problem. What I'm actually going to do is just try to restart the. Yep. Okay, so camera 1 is now restarting because I've had a very few problems with these pan tilt zoom cameras. Haven't had that particular problem for quite a long time because I send a heartbeat. It would sort of go to sleep in terms of disconnecting, but it's been a little while since that's been a problem. So. Okay, so if I now move back onto back onto this camera. Oh, it doesn't have an NDI feed anymore. Let's stop that. Okay, so the normal tech presentation gods are cursing me in the normal way. However, we can do other things. Obviously, it's more than just video, so we can show some text and we can do bold and italics. This is really limited, and it's deliberately limited, and you edit it with a text file, which I'll show you in a minute. Either some inline text if you only need something, like all of these ones are inline text, I think. But you can also use a song database that I've got, which is a single file with 1,000 sets of hymn words and whatever. Or here's a text file that's just for this one thing. You can mix and match. So, it looks like this camera is now working again, and let's see. Oh no, yep, okay. So camera 1 is now happy again, but we can have the camera on and some text as well, and still do all the things. And this is what we tend to use. Let me just scroll down, tilt down so you can see my head and the pages. So we can show hymn words and show people singing. We had a singing group. We're now experimenting with using the congregation instead of a singing group, as it were. But we're still singing with masks on. So there's lots of things to think about that have nothing to do with the tech. And this has always been the interesting aspect of designing this, is the tech ought to get away, get into the background as far as possible. There are other decisions to be made beyond the tech.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
What kind of cameras are you using?
Right, so these are PTZ Optics 30 times zoom. So Okay, this could be slightly scary, and when it refocuses, it's not. I don't think it's able to handle quite 30 times zoom at this short range. But if this were daytime, or let me just have a look. No, all the lights are off in my house. But my house is sort of 30 meters away. You would be able to read the title of books on our kitchen bookshelf 30 meters away. So the optical zoom is really quite astonishing. And the PTZ Optics ones are reasonably expensive, fantastic support, really great. I've also got a cheap one, which is the Minarray, and I think they're mostly the same hardware, just with different firmware. In terms of specs, they're 1080p, and they do 60 frames per second. We only actually use 30 because it's not like Zoom's going to cope with 60 frames per second anyway, and they're not doing, Zoom's not doing full HD. So 30 is fine, and that way uses a bit less bandwidth, because the NDI streams are really hungry on bandwidth, and that makes perfect sense. You're looking for good quality. Okay, so that's showing camera and text at the same time. We can show videos. This is a different mixer. So this is Icon Platform M, and I've got a couple of these, and this just shows these are motorized faders. So this was something I considered instead of the XTouch Mini, but I figured that, for one thing, motorized faders might just freak people out. It's a bit weird to see them moving on their own. And that's just controlled with MIDI, a particular sort of style of flavor of MIDI. But those are lots of fun to play with. And you can do text and video and camera all at the same time. And working out what we want to be able to mix at the same time has been quite interesting. And in particular, we can do split screen cameras. So I clearly need to, it's that one, need to move that down a bit. There we go. So when the junior church band is playing, sometimes we wouldn't normally show two views of the same person. We would show one view of the band, one view of people singing, and the words of the hymn in the bottom half of the screen. And that's really useful. But we can also split things top and bottom instead, which if we didn't have, yeah, there we go, two of me. So it's slightly tricky. Let me move the camera so it's pointing at something else, so you're not seeing two of me. Those are rather lovely Miro prints. So it's useful to have two cameras, partly for switching from one to the other, but partly to show them at the same time. And finally, what I'm going to show you in a minute in terms of user interface on the Stream Deck is virtual scroll bars. So this is the most boring text file ever. It just says page 1, page 2, page 3, etc., etc. So that's the end of the demo of what people see, both on Zoom and in the church building. If I now stop sharing and then start sharing again and share at your service itself, this might look slightly familiar to you in terms of lots of group boxes and things. But basically we have the service plan over on the left-hand side with just some things to do. So as it happens, all of these aren't really changing much on the mixer, but every time you double click on one of these or do the equivalent on the Stream Deck, it will set the cameras to the right presets and change the mixer and show whatever words are used and show video and PowerPoint and whatever. The idea is you've pre-configured everything so that at the touch of one button, it sets the scene correctly for whatever's coming next. So that's where that part happens. The right-hand side is the sort of advanced bit that most of the time, hopefully most people won't need to use. the camera, this is a giant button, and the way that this button works, if I can't easily show you the camera inlaid over the user interface unless no, I think it would be fiddly. Let me see. You might. Do you still see the whole window, or do you see the camera view as well? I suspect you can only see the application. Okay,
We just see the application.
Yeah, never mind. The idea of this button is while you have the mouse button pressed down, it acts as a bit of a joystick. So if I'm in the center, you can see it says pan speed 1. So that I can see that's panning very slowly to the right. If I go further over to the right, then it's got pan speed 20 and the camera starts whipping around. I can have it over here, and basically it moves up, down, left, right at a speed that is appropriate for where you are within the button. Or you've got sort of simple adjustments of up, down, left and right. That's one bit where I did actually have to fiddle around with some algorithm just for a change, because you want it to move a little bit up, and in terms of angle, moving so that it looks like it's a little bit up when it's zoomed in massively, you only want to move a tiny bit. Whereas if you're zoomed right out, then you actually need to move significantly more. So it does query the camera to say, how far are you zoomed in at the moment? And then I will do a proportional amount based on the zoom. And then the bottom part is the scene controls. So this is for, excuse me, people who want to use keyboard and mouse get to see what's going on with their contextual controls. So it's showing that we've got some text and you can move around and move with the scroll bar as well. So keys work, mouse works as you kind of expect. This is only showing text. When I had video plus camera plus text, you can see, well, you've got the video playback that you can pause and change the volume and even put that into one corner, for example. You've got the camera, not with pan, tilt, zoom bits here. We can do presets. So, right, move the camera over to the pulpit or the lectern or whatever, but not the fine-tuned adjustment. But it does have the layout. So where do we want to show the camera at the moment, which sort of maps to the tab here, but it's whatever cameras are enabled. So if I had split screen cameras, then I can control both cameras from down here, whereas I'd have to switch between two different tabs to control them both from the advanced area. So that's sort of what it looks like from a Windows perspective. If I now go back to stop screen share rather than hang up, start screen share again, and I need to stop the scene. Right, there we go. So we've done the demo. So while all of that was happening, this is a photo that I took a long time before, but it's of basically the same demo service. And you can see the Stream Deck XL has 4 rows of 8 buttons, and the top 2 rows of those are sort of the service plan, so they're switching between different scenes. And the bottom 2 rows are, again, contextual controls. So the very bottom row is either text if you're presenting text, or you get dinky little PowerPoint slide previews, because the PowerPoint API lets you take screenshots of slides, and I can take the screenshots at 72 or 96 by 96 pixels and show them on the tiny little Stream Deck buttons. I should have explained, by the way, for people who haven't used the Stream Deck before, a Stream Deck is a bunch of buttons, and each button is also a screen. Just a small screen, a remarkably good screen. This weekend just gone, I decided to have a play and thought, well, I know how to capture the data from these pan tilt zoom cameras. I wonder if I can display that video on a Stream Deck? And it turns out, yes, you can. So I will be writing a blog post in the next week or so with some demo code that you won't be able to use for complicated reasons, but you can see the WPF side of things, so that you can have previews on the left-hand side of, single button previews of all the cameras you're using, and then press one of those buttons, and then it goes across the rest of the Stream Deck. It's dead fun. Not terribly useful, but really fun. But you can see here we've got the contextual buttons of the play, pause, and back and forward by 10 seconds. It shows you how far through the video it is. It lets you change the volume, and then you can adjust the words as well. And in the next picture, this is what I call the virtual scroll bar. And this is why I showed you the boring thing with 10 pages of text. Because what you do if you've got, I've got the idea of a next button to be able to do next slide, please, etc. Well, what do you do if you've got more than 8 slides on a hymn, which is quite common? Well, I wanted to keep the idea of there being one button that would be the only thing you ever need to press, usually, which is the next, that green button in the bottom right for next is great. So whatever is selected, and this yellow highlighting that you can see on the photo, that's just something that I've whipped up. The SDK for the Stream Deck lets you put anything you want there, but I had to build the things to say I'm going to highlight a yellow border. And I've got this idea of the virtual scroll bar, so it will show you up to 8 things. If you've only got 8 pages, then show them all. There's no point in having a scroll bar. Otherwise, show 5 pages, the next button, and move further over to the left and move further over to the right. And that was it took me a little while. It sort of looks obvious when you've done it, but it took me a little while to work out that was the right user interface design. It needed to be sufficiently non-obstructive, there's a word, inconspicuous, I guess, that it didn't get in the way when you wanted to see the pages, but it was always available, so you weren't stuck if you'd gone further and you wanted to get back to an earlier slide. So those are the various user interface options and sort of what it can do. In terms of how I iterated over it, and I'm rapidly running out of mental steam and voice, by the way, so I will be wrapping up quite quickly. I've gone through several iterations, and they're not formal iterations by any means, but generally speaking, I realize I need to do something, and I make it work a bit, and I do this at home. I've got my home setup that has as much of the duplicate hardware as I can, so that I can test it all at home, and then get it to work, install it at church, and then I always take a notebook with me to the church building, and I write down in the middle of the service, right, it would be useful if it showed all non-muted people in red. I haven't yet implemented that. That might happen this weekend. So write down those pain points, then get round to removing them, then teach other people how to use it, and then watch them using it, because they will have pain points that aren't the same pain points as yours. I've only taught people so far. And in fact, we had a church council meeting last night, and one of the things in our action plan is John needs to teach other people how to create these service plans, because even though some people now know how to run a service, if I've prepared it for them, they don't know how to prepare it. And I'm definitely a bottleneck. The bus factor is not great for Tilehurst at the moment. So I've taught them basics, and then I need to teach people how to prepare the service. And that sort of iteration seems to be working quite well. Yeah, again, I need to update this presentation, because cameras 2 and 3, well, camera 2 is fully installed. Camera 3 is sitting on a windowsill in the church building, facing the congregation. And it's already been slightly useful, but we're waiting to put it on the wall as well. And it's been really useful to be able to prepare stuff at home and not have to. In fact, I usually do take my laptop into the church building, but the idea certainly is that anyone else doesn't need to be messing with USB sticks or taking a laptop. They can upload their service, get to the church building, download it again, and go for it. But they've also got to be able to sort of run the service at home. So I've been doing all this on 2 screens because that's what we have in the church building itself. We've got the monitor and then the projector, and the whole of the monitor is used for user interface, and then the projector is just what we're projecting. Well, what happens if you only got one screen? As it happens, I take up the top right hand corner as sort of the fake projector side of things. But what happens if you haven't got a camera? Well, okay, I can have a blue background with an orange sort of rectangle in that will move around as you try to pan tilt. So you get a bit of a feel of it. You get to see, okay, I'm moving from one preset to another. You can have a fake mixer. So you can see, yes, it is changing. If you're running through the service to practice it, you can see without any of the hardware, yes, that has unmuted Radio Mic 2 when I'd expected it to, etc. So, church in the new normal. Eventually, I'd really hoped that by now we would be at a new normal, but I'm expecting in a year's time, 90%, maybe 95% of the people will be in the church building on a Sunday morning. But we will still have Zoom for people who need it for all the reasons I said before. We will still do what I started doing, which is I copy off the church computer the whole video and then condense it down to just people reading and people preaching or giving talks for various reasons. That's helpful in terms of copyright. And we put that on our YouTube channel. So you don't get the full service that way, but you do get a fair chunk of it. And another thing that we've had, and we've had less success with this, but I think we'll try again, is the audio only version of the full service on, I don't think I've got a picture of it, but there are some little boxes that have a big yellow turning knob on the front. That is also the on-off button. And the idea is people who really aren't tech savvy, and we need to work out a better way of explaining this, because I'm convinced the technology is simple enough. We just need to get over the barrier of fear, really. That stick a USB stick in the top, turn it, then they can turn it on at their leisure, listen to the whole service and feel, okay, they've worshipped at a different time to the rest of us, but they're still part of the church. I'm really, really keen that we're as inclusive as we can possibly be. So instead of one way of worshipping at Tilehurst Methodist Church, there are 4. You can turn up in person, you can watch on Zoom live, you can watch the YouTube video later on, or you could listen to the audio. And for different people, those will be differently appealing. So to really wrap up, this has all been lots of fun. The reason I have overrun is because I love talking about this so much. I've really enjoyed building it, and I use it every single week. I use this, and most of the time it works. You've observed it failing to work tonight, and I still don't know why the camera sort of stopped responding. I will have a look at some logs later on, but every week it's genuinely useful. And that gives me a real buzz. It's one thing hearing things from your customers when you are your own customer, when you know your customers, when you know your users. That's great. And integration in particular is fun because, as I mentioned before, the amount of value you can get out of a relatively small amount of code can be really huge. If things go wrong, well, it can be really tricky. Working around the camera not responding sometimes. I've had to put something into at your service saying, please reboot the camera, because there have been times it's misbehaved slightly differently in the church building. But there are times where that's important. If the SDK doesn't have a feature you need, that might be a real problem. For example, on Zoom, if we're showing someone else doing the reading, then we go full screen in Zoom in the church building. Anyone watching on Zoom just sees that person being spotlit. But in the church building, we go full screen, and a big message comes up saying, press escape to exit full screen. Well, I really don't want that message, but at the moment, there's nothing you can do about it on the SDK. As it happens, I'm now looking at my email because I requested this in the Zoom SDK. And it looks like, I haven't looked at the body of it yet, but it looks like I may not get there, but we'll see. It's nice to be able to request this stuff, but you need to sometimes accept that my use case may not be the common one that Zoom is aiming for. That's fair enough. Yeah, I'm not the huge enterprise paying them millions of dollars, so you take the rough with the smooth. Open source libraries and things make everything easier. Documentation is absolutely fantastic when it's available. Sometimes the open source library doesn't do exactly what you want, so maybe you need to fork it. Maybe you need to write your own instead. Well, it's worth trying these things. But it is so much fun being able to do this to start with. User interfaces, if you are not a skilled user interface designer, like I am not a skilled user interface designer, then designing for anyone but yourself can be really tough, particularly if that other person is going to give you feedback like it didn't work and won't give details because they're not used to giving diagnostic level details and bug reports. If you get some users who can do that, that's fantastic. But some people are going to be scared of the technology. Some people just don't have the time to put in to learning it as much as they would like to. They may be utterly willing to do it, but everyone's busy. But fundamentally, writing code and then seeing it used, even if it's just by you or by friends, family, whatever, it's immensely rewarding. This isn't about Tilehurst Methodist Church. This is about what are you going to build next? And with that, I think I'm done. I will stop sharing. So thank you ever so much for, good, there are still some people here. You've been very patient with me, rambling on my enthusiasm for doing this. I hope it's been inspiring for you, and you'll note that none of the tech is, I didn't go back to the bits of somewhat interesting codey stuff, because the code itself, anyone could have written all of the code I've written. Not that I would profess to being really anything special in terms of a software developer. I'm moderately competent, but I'm no Donald Knuth. But none of the code I've written was hard. Working out what I wanted to do, working out how the integration worked, that was the tricky bit. So go figure out what you're going to build next.
Cool. Does anyone have any questions for Jon?
I should probably raise a hand. This is Jim. How do you handle the problem of a mic feedback like right now we're getting?
Right. So we don't tend to have much feedback. We have our speakers in the church building are facing away from the front, as it were. So we could get feedback if someone had a handheld mic and was going around the congregation and ended up near a speaker. The way I would handle that is I reach for the mute button as quickly as I can. We did have a feedback destroyer. It's currently broken. We haven't needed it for quite a long time. So it just hasn't been much of an issue, but it easily could be. In fact, we do have one problem with feedback, which is I normally take my iPad to the church building so that I can dial into Zoom, and I wear headphones to hear what people on Zoom are hearing most of the time, and occasionally take them off to hear what people in the church building are hearing. And if I forget to mute the iPad, then that's quite near a speaker. So anytime that the computer output is on, which is sort of from Zoom, then you can get a feedback loop across the whole of Zoom round via the iPad. So I do need to remember to mute the iPad and if I ever do unmute all, I need to remember to remute the iPad. And I don't have a technical solution for that. I just need to remember to do it. Sorry to disappoint. There's nothing clever.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Okay. I'm getting up in 5.5 hours, so I will need to go to sleep soon.
Yeah, just as a reminder for everyone, John is what, 5 hours ahead of us?
Yeah, that's right.
So this is let me thank him because this is a treat and at the end of a very long day.
It's fun though.
But on behalf of TVUG, thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording now. I usually do a quick edit in the recordings over the weekend, then I'll post them up on YouTube. And then the link to that I posted earlier in the chat, and it's also on the meetup page.
I shall look forward to looking.